Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, June 28th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about the 2020 House elections and how many close races proved to be pivotal for the GOP and their possibility of gaining control in the 2022 midterm elections. Now, on your screen is the generic ballot polling data from the 2020 election, and I'm showing this to you so you understand which type of environment we thought the Democratic Party was in back in the 2020 election. It seemed as if the Democratic Party was going to win the popular vote in the generic ballot by a pretty considerable amount. The Democrats were at 50% and the Republicans at 43%, so we expected them to win by around 7 points. That ended up not being the case with a victory of just around 4 points for the Democratic Party on the national level. With this estimation of a 7-point plus margin of victory, the 2020 House forecast across many major firms showed the Democrats were potentially expected to gain seats. Our 80% of outcomes fell in the range between 225 seats and 254 Democratic seats, which means that 225 Democratic seats were as equally likely as 254. But the thing is, we reached 222 Democratic seats, so they severely underperformed what these estimations were, but not necessarily out of pure fault by the Democratic Party. Many of these races came down to the wire where just a handful of votes quite literally made the difference in terms of partisan control and could be the very, reason why the Democrats are potentially expected to do so poorly in the 2022 House elections. Looking at the House elections so far, the Republicans currently need 5 seats in order to win back control. 5 seats from the Democratic Party, and for reference, back in 2010, they picked up 63. In 2014, they expanded their House majority to the largest we've ever seen in the 21st century for the Republican Party. So, looking at the House election results in the past, I will say the Republicans are probably in good company, knowing that midterm elections with incumbent Democratic presidents typically do them well. But looking at our 2020 results, I'm highlighting this to show you that, potentially speaking, maybe some of these districts, if drawn in a similar fashion or drawn in a just as competitive way, could be possibilities for Democrats to push back or hinder Republican control. And the reason that, we would see that happen is largely because the Democrats are going to need to play damage control. They are going to have to play defense in 2022 because they know that these elections are likely to be unfavorable. Here are our House election results from the 2020 election. You can see that the GOP on the top right received 48% of the vote, the Democrats receiving 51%. The Republicans flipped 15 seats with a net gain of 12 points nationwide. Can you imagine showing this to a Democrat a few days before the election? Every estimation, every poll, every place had the Democrats gaining seats. Very few people did get it right on the money in terms of the partisan composition, but it could have been very wrong. The people who were able to predict Republicans gaining exponentially could have also been incorrect had the House elections just shifted by just 2 points in some of these key races. Looking at the toss-up races column on the New York Times, you might see that Republicans won every single one of them, and in some of these Democratic lean areas, they also won there. But that isn't necessarily what would have been the case had the results been just slightly different. I've actually gone ahead and shown you a new House map in terms of what the numbers would be if the House results in these key races were decided just 2 points more leftward. Essentially, if a candidate on the Democratic side lost by 1.9%, in this case, they would win by 0.1%. And I choose 2% because it seems very negligible. Looking at the House election results, many races were decided by less than 2%. So it is quite fascinating that if you just shifted by 2 points, the map ends up very different. Democrats would be ahead of Republicans by 25 seats with 230 seats to the Republicans' 205. It would be a decrease from what they got in 2018, but only a 5-seat loss versus a 13-seat loss. And the reason, that I think this is something that needs to be pointed out is that Republicans also might be in a position where their districts aren't as safe as they might think. With incumbents, of course, you are always going to have that advantage, but if they don't have a similar down ballot or, Republican boost effect like they had in 2020, it's very possible that Democrats are able to push back and counteract some of these major losses in some of these districts. I don't think that it's enough to ensure Democrats holding onto the majority or even put them in a position where they are likely to win the House majority in 2022, but I will say that I do expect the Democratic Party to target some of these competitive districts because they know, truly speaking, that they are going to be very close, as they were in 2020, but it all depends on the districts. But it was just quite fascinating, the constant Republican projections on the right from the New York Times. Claudia Tenney in the 22nd Congressional District in the state of New York. Take a look at that district. I mean, you're talking about a margin of victory of 0.03%, exceptionally close, down to the 100th place. But the catch is, that wasn't even the closest race. The closest race was in Iowa's 2nd Congressional District, where nearly 400,000 votes were cast, yet the Republican won by just 6 votes against Rita Hart. Isn't this fascinating? I mean, looking at it, Mariannette Miller Meeks was able to win in a district that was largely expected to go to a Democrat even before the 3rd District of Iowa with the incumbent Democrat here. What was expected in the 2nd District was that Democrats were going to win here, potentially lose the 3rd and the 1st, but at least win in the 2nd. Democrats actually had the majority of the delegation back in 2018. In fact, we're potentially on a pathway in Iowa to a point where they could have won the 4th district as well. Steve King, the incumbent, only won by 3.4%. So the Democratic Party was just 3.4% away in the 4th district from actually winning the state of Iowa in terms of total delegation for Democrats to 0 Republicans. And it would have been quite fascinating. I mean, looking in the 1st district, the Democrat won there. Looking in the 3rd, it was a pickup, but the 2nd one went to the incumbent Democrat by over 10 points. Fast forward to 2020, it goes to a Republican by just 6 votes. So yes, 2% does make all the difference. And if we were shown this map on election night in 2020 or 4 days after, by the time we got our final projections, we would see this as, okay, the Democrats lost 5 seats, but it's nothing super major. This doesn't put them in an extremely vulnerable position to a point where just a couple of nominations could ultimately determine partisan control of the House of Representatives. But that's exactly what the Democratic Party is in right now. But the point being, Republicans were lucky. Plainly put, they were lucky in the 2020 House elections. They need to be lucky in 2022. These Republican victories did not come easy. I'm not one to try to discredit either political party and say, oh, it's just 2 points. No, each vote was hard fought, and the money that was spent in these districts clearly paid off on behalf of the GOP and in many competitive races for the Democratic Party. Honestly speaking, they could have lost more districts. The Democrats could have lost the House majority in 2020, ultimately giving the Republicans a pathway to prevent a Democratic trifecta through the House of Representatives. And they almost got it. But I'm not also going to try to make 2020's House election seem as if it was a red wave. I don't think this was some type of overwhelming tsunami on the Republican side that they were able to flip 15 seats and have a net gain of 12. This net gain of 12 came with an asterisk. It came with the understanding that some of these House districts were decided by the narrowest of margins. And narrow margins are nothing new to House elections, but I will say that in the 2018 elections, most of these Democratic victories, taking them out of the 2-point margin or higher, the Democrats would have still easily won this House majority. In the case of 2020, it could have made all the difference. From 235 down to 230 looks a lot better than 235 down to 222, especially when you need 218 for control, which means you're just 4 seats ahead of where you need to be. And what I expect in the 2022 House elections is that some of these Republicans won't necessarily retire, but might be prompted to move congressional districts. Is some of these more prominent Republicans are in positions where their district is redrawn, the incumbent party, the Republican Party in many of these states, may be inclined to redistrict them and move them around to essentially put them in a more favorable position ahead of 2020. When you take a look at the House election results in Iowa in the 2020 election, I can tell you now, these districts will not nearly be as pro-democratic in 2022. They will not nearly be as competitive in 2022. Because you have these newly elected Republicans that the incumbent Republican Party in Iowa, which has control over the state redistricting process, would want to keep them in office, and thus is going to probably draw just 1 Democratic district in Iowa versus potentially 3, or in 2018's case, 4. This map was drawn under different assumptions under the 2010 census, as were many other states, which means that the House elections were built off of that map. They were in a position where possibly back then, nobody could have envisioned a Democrat winning in the 6th district in Georgia when Republicans were winning there when it was Newt Gingrich's district. I mean, you are looking at some of these districts going under major reforms, including Oklahoma's 5th district, which nobody expected to even be competitive back in 2018, yet a Democrat won, then lost in 2020, but not nearly by as much as the Democrats in years past. So a lot of these gains made by the Democratic Party in 2018 are not necessarily reversing, but keeping their pretty close-knit status. And of course, many of them were defeats for Democrats, but I just wanted to point this out because it was important to understand how the Republicans came to such a favorable point in the 2022 House elections, to a point where redistricting alone can single-handedly determine partisan control of the House of Representatives. In this instance, I mean, you could just see the redrawn districts in Michigan or Wisconsin or Ohio or Iowa or Florida that could draw out many Democratic regions, input Republican ones in the same areas, just differently drawn districts, and then the Republicans could win back those 5 seats. They could eventually just flip the House of Representatives just simply by winning through redistricting processes. That means, this is going to be a much bigger election than we probably think. At least right now, the Republican Party isn't showing many major expectations, I would say, in terms of overall chances of winning. When I'm looking at the generic ballot in the most recent elections, I don't know if it's going to take me there. It's not going to take me there, unfortunately. But if I go to the latest polls tab, I can show you there. If you go to the generic ballot, occasionally Republicans pop up in the victory, but Democrats are typically taking ahead. That is also the case if you look back at the 2010 polling. In 2009, Democrats led throughout the entirety of that year. 2014, another abysmal year for Democrats. Democrats led throughout the entirety of 2013. So while we won't have the best indication until early next year, right now I'm not seeing any early inclination that there will be a Republican wave, but typically midterm elections do start out the same way. Democrats do take a lead, and then eventually Republicans are ahead, but we haven't seen that surface yet. Including Joe Biden's approval rating isn't one that is necessarily dropping significantly. It's holding on to where it was before and is pretty much in that honeymoon phase. Now, Obama starts to drop off in just a few months, so we will see if it matches that expectation where Biden's numbers will start to dwindle into the overall negative. But if they don't, potentially Joe Biden could be a popular president leading into the 2022 midterm elections. It would be unheard of. We've never seen a president consistently approved of throughout the entirety of their term. But again, we have seen a number of first this election season, and Joe Biden might be one of those first presidents. And looking at the 2022 House elections, the Sabato's Crystal Ball released these crossover House districts graphic where it can show you exactly which Republicans and which Democrats are winning in regions in which the opposition party wins in on the presidential level. Well, as you can see there, it's probably equally split between Democrats and Republicans, which is sort of a bad sign for many of these Democrats. You see, with this redistricting process, many of these states in which you see Democrats winning in where Republicans won in on the presidential level, they have Republican-controlled areas. When you're looking at Pennsylvania, when you're looking at Wisconsin, when you're looking at Iowa, the Republican Party has control over how these districts are drawn. And for the case of California, you can expect the Independent Commission to likely put these Republicans in a more competitive position, but it will require the year being a beneficial one for the Democratic Party. 2020 was a year in which Democrats won the House election by 3.1%. nationwide. 3.1% isn't, too good, obviously, when you won by 8-9 points in the previous midterm election and, won on the presidential level by 5 points, but 3.1% is better than being down, which some Republicans expect to be the result in 2022. Looking at these results here, with a 3.1% victory for Democrats, the Republican Party won all of the close races. Even with this victory on the popular vote, Republicans won every single race that mattered, and sometimes by extremely narrow amounts. This sets the bar pretty high for Democrats. This means Democrats need to win the generic ballot in 2022 if they want to be able to retain control. And not only win it by 3.1%, potentially much higher than that. You're talking a 4-point margin, you're talking a 5-point margin, and also we've seen models that show Democrats need a 10-point margin in order to gain seats in the House of Representatives. Do I think gaining seats is something that the Democratic Party should be shooting for rather than just playing defense? Probably not. But defense doesn't mean much when you just have 4 seats that could quite literally change partisan control overnight. When the Republicans only need 5, they could very well get there by redistricting, which means Democrats do need to be playing defense in many regards. But looking at these crossover districts, looking at the narrow selected House races in the 2020 elections, they just hold some quite interesting background information that you guys should understand as to why the Republican Party is in such a favorable position. Yes, it's by hard work. Yes, it is by campaigning and strategizing and working in these districts and canvassing, etc. But it was also through luck. Winning a race by 6 votes, yes, a lot of your work does go into it, but at that point, it is negligible. When the margin is decided by less than 0.01%, yes, it is negligible. When your margin is decided by 2 points or less in House districts, that could be easily overturned by the next election. 2 points is not a lot in House districts. 2 points means it's a prime opportunity for the opposition party to pick it up. Now, we don't know exactly how these districts are going to be drawn following the 2020 census, but I will say that this 2-point switch really could have changed control dramatically. It really could have put the Democratic Party in a much easier position in terms of passing bills, in terms of the House consolidating around Nancy Pelosi and other types of major pieces of legislation, versus 222, which means just 4 Democrats dissenting would ultimately put the Democrats in the minority for many of these votes, especially with a number of vacancies rampant across the House of Representatives. So just keep this in mind when you look at 2022. Why do the Republicans have such a good position at winning? Well, it was those narrow House races that ultimately determined this control. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 midterm election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.